And we'll remind everyone the historical situation is that Hezekiah had sent ambassadors to Sennacherib and who's the Assyrian king, with a tribute of 30 talents of gold and 300 talents of silver. They returned home with the news that Sennacherib accepted the tribute money, but then was demanding their total surrender in spite of it. And so in this chapter, he first sets forth a prayer of praise for what God will do, but he also, in verses 7 through 9, sets forth the sad, pitiful condition of the people. In verses 10 through 12, he tells them about Assyria's end. And starting in verse 13 and going through verse 16, that it causes amazement coming from God's mighty work. That what God has done is in relationship to the Assyrian nation would be acknowledged by both those afar off and those who are near, by the entire world. They will hear about what God has done to this powerful Assyrian nation. And they will realize thus that it is God's might that does this and not man's. In verse 14 then, he talks about, yet there are some who very simply refuse to accept the evidence. Even today you can present evidence that clearly shows something, proves something, and some people still refuse to believe it. You can do that in relationship to the existence of God. You can do it in relationship to salvation, the church, numerous things that the Bible is very clear on. And yet some simply do not accept it. They will still reject it, and they will live their unrighteous, their godless lives. And so there's the question then at the end, who will be able to dwell among this devouring fire? And God is described that way, as a devouring fire. Who's going to dwell among or with the everlasting burnings? Basically saying the same thing in parallelism. Verse 15 then, where we had gotten to, and we had just started on that, is an answer really to the question of verse 15, or verse 14, I mean. Who's going to be able to dwell among this burning fire? Well, verse 15 tells us who. Verse 16, we mentioned last week, gives the results of those who are able to stand, who will be able to dwell among the devouring fire. And the first thing that he says, he that walketh up righteously. And we know from the 119th Psalm in verse 172 that all of God's commandments are righteous. Thus, those who walketh righteously are those who are walking or living, their lifestyle is that of being obedient to all of God's commands. They are living their lives in conformity to God's law. The second thing that he mentions, and speaketh uprightly. The Hebrew really uses the word straightness or fairly. And that's what the word, or integrity. speaks with straightness or speaks with integrity. Someone whose speech is pure, truthful. They're not going to deviate from that which is true. It's going to be reverent, upbuilding, not destructive in nature. Someone turn over to Ephesians 4th chapter and read verse 25 and stay there for a second because we'll read another verse there. Is that 25? Okay. All right, put away lying, speak truth. Well, that's someone who's speaking uprightly, isn't it? They're going to be telling the truth. One of the problems is that any time someone tells a lie, can they ever be trusted? Now, you might work up to that trust, but there's always in the back of your mind in there that question is, are they telling the truth this time?
If they repent and start bringing forth fruit to make repentance, Matthew 8, you start watering them slowly.
Well, that's why I say you can build up that trust. But that takes time. And the problem with lying is that you lose confidence in people. No one trusts you. You have to tell the truth. But then God is a God of truth, isn't he? And well, John 8 and verse 44 says that ye are of your father the devil, and the lust of your father you will do. He was a murderer from the beginning and abode not in the truth. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is the father of lies. When you speak a lie, you go on over into Satan's side. You're no longer a part of God. You're of your father the devil. That's why telling the truth is always so important. And yet, in our society, for years and years now, probably decades, I shouldn't say years, decades now, it has been acceptable to tell lies. We try and distinguish little, as we call them, white lies from really bad lies. But if you read John 8:44, is there any difference? And doesn't Revelation 21 and chapter 22 both state that all liars shall have their part in the lake of fire? Not just those who tell the whopper lies, but all liars.
How many people today believe in the devil or angels?
Well, that's true. A lot of people don't believe in the devil or eternal punishment. But
you've already mentioned, I think, biblical deceit.
I remember, how long ago was it? It was at least 30 to probably 35 years ago is when I first came across that biblical ethical deceit. Well, no, it doesn't. Anytime the word deceit is used in the Bible, it's used in a negative way, that it's sinful. But yet there were some arguing that biblical ethical deceit, or that deceit was both biblical and it was ethical to do. That's what the phrase, biblical ethical deceit. I like the way one person put it. Biblical ethical deceit, BED, puts you in bed with the devil. That's one of the things, Abraham's lie. There's others, for example, when God instructed Israel, and this is where you get into a lot of these things in the question of war. God instructed Israel as they were attacking Ai to go up and then pull back like they were retreating the first time. They deceived them, didn't they? And so they came out from the city, and that's when they were destroyed. Dale?
King David deceived Uriah, giving him the impression that everything's fine, and then he told Joab to put him in the front part of the battle and run away from him and let him shoot arrows at him. Why he ain't got no arrows?
Okay. There's another, but I don't think anyone tried to justify David's actions, though. Do you justify God's actions in telling Israel to retreat like that so that they would come out of the city? That's that's another one. Rahab the harlot lied to the people of Jericho. There's a lot of instances. Lying is never wrong, or actually not. Well, I put that one the wrong way, didn't I? Lying is never right. Deceiving someone is lying to them. A person can, though, be self-deceived, where they deceive themselves. That's not your fault. So there's distinctions to be made. How many times did the Bible use the phrase, be not deceived? Why? Because it's easy to be deceived. But we have to tell the truth. And go back to Ephesians 4 and look at verse 29.
Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good you use to edify, that it may minister grace unto the hearer.
Okay? Corrupt communication. That only means we can't blaspheme God, right? Listen to what I said again. That means it only blaspheme God. Does it apply to anything else? Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Well, that would be a part of it, but corrupt communication is language that just simply is vile. It doesn't necessarily have to be blaspheming God.
Philippians 4 tells us what kind of language we should have. And about 5 or 6 statements. What we should have pure language.
Well, that's what we're to think on. When we think on those things, our language should demonstrate that. But corrupt communication does not have to be blaspheming God. It can be just, well, I would use the phrase gutter language. It's the language that we hear being used all the time in our society today. The sexual innuendos that are made, that's corrupt communication. The try and be careful because you don't want to end up using corrupt communication to describe corrupt communication. The use of bodily functions, and all of those type of things. That's corrupt communication. We should not be using language like that. Much less the golly, gee whiz, and those are simply euphemisms for God or Jesus, or darn is a euphemism for damn. And you could just go on and on with the ones that we hear today on a regular basis. The filthy jokes. That's corrupt communication.
The last thing in the world Christians should do is participate in laughter at filthy jokes.
Well, you're right. The laughter that we give, or that people give to those filthy jokes, just prompts more of them. And yeah, I will. Years ago, when most of you were growing up and you turned on the television and you would hear these comedians, Red Skelton comes to mind. There were a lot of others. We're able to have you rolling in the floor laughing without ever using anything dirty at all. We've gone from that to another extreme to where a comedian today just about can't use anything clean in his jokes. And for those old days where you had that clean laugh, and people just laugh and take it in, and as if all of that is funny, when in reality it is corrupt communication that needs to be put a stop to. And let me add another thing. Social media. I don't know how many of you are on Facebook or Twitter or all of these others. I don't even remember all of them. But how many times, and I see Christians, they won't say this, but they will retweet or repost something from someone that someone else has said that has dirty language in it. When you do that, aren't you just as guilty as the person who put it up originally? And it'll have your name on it now. I'm on Twitter. I do a lot of the political stuff on Twitter. Facebook, it's purely biblical material. But I noticed I was starting to read through one tweet, and I retweeted it. And at the very end, it had a dirty word, and I had to remove it. Couldn't put it up, simply because of the language that was used. Because at that point in time, by doing so, I've given my approval to it. There's a lot of things that I wish that I could put out, but you can't because of the language that's involved. Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth. Then in verse 31 of Ephesians 4.
All bitterness and wrath and anger, clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice.
Okay, evil speaking. So you have a re-emphasis. It's interesting. You've got verse 25, put away lying. Verse 29, no corrupt communication. Verse 31, evil speaking, put away from. Think that there's an emphasis on our language in these verses? We need to be careful as to what we say and how we say things.
It says that every idle word that man shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment. For by thy words thou shalt be justified and condemned later on.
Okay, that's in Matthew the 12th chapter, verse 36 and 37. Because he does state there, by thy words thou shalt be justified, and by thy words thou shalt be condemned. So we have to be careful. Let's add Colossians 4 and verse 6. Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer every man. There's the criteria that we use for good speech. Always with grace, seasoned with salt. Salt is a seasoning flavor. It makes things that are bland taste good. Some of you have been on bland diets. How many of you enjoy it? I don't remember seeing anyone who's enjoyed a bland diet because you take all of the salt out of it.
Daddy used to say to the doctor when he was in the hospital, said, God commanded salt in his sacrifice. It's good for him, it's got to be good for me.
Need to remember that if I'm ever in that situation. But the salt makes things flavorful, where it tastes good. Well, here's speech seasoned with salt. Make it palatable. We're the salt of the earth. Matthew 5, 16. Or no, that's 16. In James, the 3rd chapter, really starting with verse 2 and going on through verse 12, I believe is what it is, James deals with the power of the tongue, both for good and for evil. We're not going to read all of that, but notice verses 9 and verse 10. When he says, therewith, talking about the tongue now, bless with God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceedeth blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be. So we need to be careful again. Make sure that if we're blessing God, we certainly cannot be cursing man. In these first two things, walketh righteously, speaketh uprightly, you have a harmony between his actions and his speech. There's a harmony there. They're both right. And again, uprightly, you have your basic word, right, which is, again, the basis of righteously. It's right. So, similarity, actions and language. The next thing he says, he that despiseth the gain of oppressions. He's not going to try to extort others or get gain by oppressing someone else. He despises such actions as that. When you go back in the Old Testament, The Israelites were allowed to loan money to other Israelites, but they were not allowed to charge usury, which is interest, to their own nation. Later on, we see them doing that, and they are condemned by it and for it. They could charge usury to others, just not to Israelites. There's nothing wrong with charging interest. But when we try to charge outrageous amounts of interest, then there's something wrong with that. And for young people who might watch this, be careful with the credit cards. The average person that has credit cards debt, if they pay the minimum amount, guess about how long it's going to take them to pay it off?
12 years.
30 or more? That's closer.
Wow.
Just paying the minimum amount. Now, it's easy for most people to get a credit card. They send them to you unwanted. And then guess what they do? They up the limit so you can spend more. There's an old principle, learn to live on the income that you've got. They're not taught that today. And they get into debt that is so high, then what happens? Well, we'll just declare bankruptcy.
The government hates it.
And then, upon that bankruptcy, they don't have to pay the debts. Now, the Christian would. Christian would still have the responsibility to pay those debts. And I've known Christians who have gone into bankruptcy. They still owe the money. As a Christian, maybe not as according to the world and to the government, but the Christian still owes the money. He borrowed it, he has to pay it back. But they need to learn to live on what they make and not buy everything on credit card. Now then, I will admit, we buy everything on credit card. Now then, the reason being, we get money back. There's a certain percentage, either 1, 2, sometimes even 3% back. And then we pay off the credit card every month, total. But over the years, you can make several $1,000s that way. But that's paying it off every month, too. We don't owe anything. But this is from the opposite standpoint. You're going to oppress someone to gain. Push them down to try to lift yourself up. And this person, he despises such action. Have you ever seen someone trying to get ahead in the business world, and to do that, they will try and destroy others? That's this. Christian's not going to be like that. He's not going to try to get ahead, get gain by oppressing other people. Pam?
I took a
I'm not laughing from the standpoint that I don't believe it. I absolutely believe that. That if you cannot put someone else out of business, you don't need to go in that business anyway. That's shameful thoughts. But that is what's being taught. Well, I'll get, that's a political thought that there's a certain amount of money and it's not going to grow, and if you get a certain amount, then you got to either take it from someone else or else you're not going to have any. It's not you can grow and I can grow. And we all be honest and grow together. That's the reality of the situation, but what is taught is, for example, talk about somebody who's rich today. Filthy rich. I mean, multi-millionaire, billionaire, whatever. They're stealing money from their workers. That's the thought. No, they're not. They're making money, sure. So are their workers. Where would the workers be if they didn't work for that person? He's not stealing their money. He's not oppressing them. Now, the problem with communism, which is anti-God, is that you've got to oppress everyone else because everything belongs to the state. And so the state is going to oppress you. And you're going to have to work for them. And then rely upon them to give you whatever they determine is that they'll give you. That's not the principles of Christianity. I see y'all got me talking in politics, and I didn't want to do that. Closely akin to that is the next one, that shaketh his hands from holding of bribes. That's a little bit of not the way that we would express things. It's expressing the idea if somebody puts a bribe in your hand, basically, I can't hold it. I can't allow it to be in my hand, so I shake my hands. That's the idea that's being presented here. He's not going to accept a bribe.
That's the way a lot of them pass by, they put it in the hand, shake hands with it.
And there's the money, and you shake hands.
And this encounters were bribed or whatever to do what they did to Jesus.
Well,
And they were supposed to shake their hands, and they didn't.
Judas was bribed to betray Jesus. But this is expressing someone who, if he's given a bribe, he just shakes his hand and basically the money drops to the ground. If he's shaking his hands, the bribe cannot remain there. And so that's why that shaketh his hands. He's just shaking his hands. He's getting rid of the bribe. It cannot stay in his hands that way. During the prophets' times, judges and rulers of Israel, it was a common thing for them to accept bribes. Since I've gotten on politics a lot tonight, a great deal of our politicians live on bribes. The lobbying industry is basically giving bribes to politicians to get them to vote however they want them to vote. Well, this is indicating a person who's going to walk or dwell within those everlasting burnings, they're not going to accept bribes. Yeah, I think that was Felix, wasn't it? That he kept getting Paul to come back and speak to him because he basically wanted a bribe to let Paul go. I'll let you go if you pay me. And Paul wouldn't pay him, of course. He preached him sermon every time. But yeah, that's basically the way in which things worked to a great extent. You get thrown in jail, just pay enough money and you get out. A bribe to the judge or to the governor or whoever it might be. But that was common during those days. In our day, it's a lot the same. I know of a person who is going to go into real estate business, construction work in particular. And they were told when they started, you're going to have to pay people under the table, or else you cannot stay in business. Person was Christian. They said, well, I'm not going to do that. And they stayed in business. Christian's not going to do that. Basically paying somebody under the table, that's a bribe. I'll pay you to do this. I will say that on the books it's this, but really we're going to give you this. So mm-hmm.
Give me $20 bill when I give her that. She left. Well, let us go right on through the thing. What was that about? You don't have to put $20 in your tax and give it to the dog. Well, I never done that. That's not right.
Yeah, it was a bribe to the person to let you go through. And yes, Christians get caught a lot of times in a situation where they don't even know what's going on. Yeah, you don't speak the language, you don't know what's going on. I remember the first time I went there, I had no concept as to what was going on. When I went to Indonesia, same thing. Had no concept what was going on. They could have been doing something and right in front of me, and I would have had no concept. And that's just same with what you're saying. Didn't know what they were doing, but it was ending up being a bribe. Yes?
The ones that sold their land typically bribed the holders and they instantly died.
Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5th chapter. In that situation, they sold the land for a certain amount and then came and lied about how much it was. Like, give a crude illustration, they sold the land for $1,000 and they came and gave $500 and they said, is this what you sold the land for? Yeah, that's what I sold the land for. So they lied to God, and that's why they were put to death. Yes, separately. First Ananias, and then later on his wife comes in, Sapphira, and they both died. which shows, again, God's attitude toward lying. But that one would not actually be a bribe. It would just more of a lie. Then he that stoppeth his ears from hearing of blood. Here it would be someone who refuses to listen to the plots and plans of murder and shedding of blood. Solomon had warned young men of this in Proverbs 1:10 through 19, and we don't have time to read all that, so you can read it at home. Proverbs 1:10 through 19. That basically we're not to listen to those things. The one who refuses to listen to it, to such plans, has taken the first steps toward protection from the consequences of such. If you listen to, for example, a plot to murder somebody, and you go ahead and listen to it without really putting a stop to it, and they go out and murder that individual, then basically you're culpable as well. And so this is saying you don't even listen to it. Stop your ears. And that's not literally, but we just refuse to listen to such. And then last, and shutteth his eyes from seeing evil. He's not going to look upon the evil, upon sin. He doesn't secretly enjoy it. Look at Romans 1 and verse 32. After Paul has listed a long list of sins in Romans 1, he then says, who knowing the judgment of God that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. So now then, he mentions first the ones who actually do it, but then there's another group over here that have pleasure in those things, in those that do them. And he's saying, basically, they're worthy of death as well. And you weren't supposed to ring the bell that early. In 1 Corinthians 13:6, I'll finish up real quick. He says, rejoiceth not in iniquity. That's a person who has love. He rejoiceth not in iniquity. He doesn't rejoice in sin. Sin should break our hearts. It should make us sad. But especially he doesn't want to participate in it. He keeps his eyes on that straight and narrow way of God. And he keeps his eyes on the goal of righteousness and the blessings of God. So next time we'll start with verse 16 then.